looks like a grate or some kind of vent cover to me, but it's the head of a razor, right? So here's another. What could this be? A cell phone, possibly? Seems metallic to me, but maybe. So this is actually the striker on a lighter. So here's another one. This one might be a little... Right. Yeah. Wrong way. Yes, this is a toothbrush, the head of a toothbrush. So just a few more. This one's a little easier, at least for those of you who are mechanics. Any guesses? A crescent wrench. Yeah, the spinny thing on a crescent wrench. All right, and one last one. What could this be? When I first saw this, it kind of looked like some kind of stringed instrument, maybe. What else could it be? So this is actually the pages of a book. So what I wanted to point out with these pictures is that it's hard to tell what the bigger picture is when zoomed in, but just like these pictures that are zoomed in real close, it's easy to tell what it is once you have a little context, right? So if I were to go back through these and show you the zoomed in parts, you wouldn't be hesitant to name what it is, because now you have context for what the bigger picture is, right? So through all of these, you can tell what these pictures are. And the reason I wanted to point this out is because life is a lot like this. We see our small picture, and we know that God sees the bigger picture, and it's hard to tell how our small picture fits in to God's bigger picture. And what helps sometimes is if we get a little context into our lives to kind of ask the questions, how is my little picture, my life, my insignificant little blip on existence, how does it compare to God's big picture? Or maybe another question we could ask is, how is God involved in the big or in the small picture when we know he sees the big? And does God care about our small picture? And I want us to turn to the book of Ruth to find the answer to these questions. Because Ruth is also a very small book compared to the rest of the biblical literature. But it's in Ruth that we see God involved in small picture details. And the characters of this story are also asking the questions that I posed before. Is God involved in the small picture? How does my small picture fit in to the bigger picture that God is painting? And so we'll turn to the book of Ruth for those answers. Now, again, Ruth is a book in the Bible that we've probably all heard before or we've read before. It's significantly small. It's only 4 chapters, and you could read it beginning to end in about 15 minutes. But I want us to go through it again and to just notice these small little details and the small story and how it plays into God's big story. And right off the bat, I want us to imagine the book of Ruth as a drama, because Ruth does play out like a drama. You can imagine the 4 chapters of the book as 4 acts of a play. And just like a play or a drama, there is setting, there is character, there is themes that run throughout. And so I believe it's a good place for us to start with the setting of the book. And you would think that a good place to start with, or to find the setting, would be the beginning. And while, yes, we do get a feel for the setting at the beginning of the book of Ruth with the first verse, in the days when the judges ruled, that's the setting. But if we turn back a page to the book of Judges, the last verse also gives us some context to the setting. So the last verse in Judges says, "In those days Israel had no king, and everyone did what they saw fit." And then we turn the page to Ruth, and it says, "In the days when the judges ruled." So we know that going into this story, this is a time when there was no king in Israel. The judges ruled, and everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes. And this is the setting in which our characters play out this drama. And so we continue in verse 1. "In those days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land." So with the setting, we get the judges, and there's a famine in the land. And then we are introduced to the characters. "So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. And they went to Moab to live there." So right at these first few verses, we get the setting for the story. And the author takes no time in setting up the plot of this story in the next verse. "Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And her 2 sons married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband." So the author takes no time, no pause to introduce this tragedy into the life of Naomi. So she is left completely empty. Her husband has died, her sons have died, and now she has no one to look after her, right? The only relatives she has are these 2 daughters-in-law, and the bonds that kind of bound them to her are gone. Her sons are dead. And now Naomi's life is empty. And so she's left to decide what to do next. And she hears that from the people in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people, and he had provided them food. So she decides to return to Bethlehem. But she knows that the road ahead is not going to be easy, as we've kind of touched on before. In the terms of women who had no male family members, they were left with only 2 options to provide for themselves, either to beg or to be prostitutes. Those were the only options available. So she knows that whatever lies ahead, it's going to be difficult. And so as she's on her way home, she turns to her 2 daughters-in-law and says, Go back to your mother's houses so that you can be married again. I don't want you to have to take this life that has been thrust upon me." Because at least for Naomi, she is a native Israelite, so things will somewhat go better for her. But for these 2 foreign daughters, they will be treated as strangers and foreigners. And no matter how bad it gets for Naomi, it will get even worse for them. And so Naomi says, I have nothing. I'm not going to have any sons for you to marry. You should go and find a way to be happy in your mother's house. And Orpah, her one daughter-in-law, takes her up on the offer. She kisses her and weeps aloud and leaves. But in verse 14 it says, Ruth clung to her. And Naomi said to her, Look, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her God. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severe, if even death separates you and me." This pledge that Ruth makes demonstrates her loyalty to her mother-in-law. Again, she had no reason to do this. It would have been better for her to go back to her parents' household so that she could be married again, but she demonstrates her loyalty to someone who has nothing. And going forward, this theme of loyalty is exemplified again and again, and we'll see this in a few other characters, but just remember the loyalty that Ruth shows and how it will play into the bigger picture later. And so the story continues that they returned to Bethlehem. And so verse 19, so the two women went on their way and came to Bethlehem. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirring because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" Now they had been gone for roughly a decade. And it's likely that maybe the women of the town didn't recognize her, but she went away with her husband and her two sons, and she came back with nothing except this stranger. And so the women think, is that Naomi? And it's just heartbreaking how Naomi replies to their questions. She says, "Don't call me Naomi." Now, in the Old Testament literature, we know that names carry significance, that the names of children is usually something that they would live up to, or people would be named for places they were born or things that they did. And so it was interesting to see that Naomi's name meant pleasant or pleasantness. But she says, "Don't call me pleasant anymore." She says, "Call me Mara." And the name Mara means bitter. And so she says, "Call me Mara because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? Why call me pleasant? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." We can relate to Naomi, can't we? That sometimes we are faced with situations of such bitterness and suffering that it almost seems like we are different people. And Naomi is no different. She is no longer pleasant, but rather bitter. And so before we move on in the story, let's back up and ask ourselves those questions that we started with. What is the big picture here, and how is God involved? So for Naomi, her small picture of her seemingly insignificant life was filled with bitterness and suffering and pain. But what was God's big picture for her? Well, even in the midst of her bitterness and suffering, in this small picture, God's big picture involved the loyalty of her daughter-in-law. While at the moment she was suffering through this bitterness and this trial, God brought Ruth into her life to show her that things were about to change. And so, as we end the first act, or the first chapter of Ruth, it ends like this. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And just to point out, the author is fond of telling us that Ruth is a foreigner, that she is a Moabite. He wants us to remember this, because in the coming acts of the play, this will play a big role. But you can see how this plays out like a drama, that the curtain closes on Act 1 with this setting up of the next scene, that they arrived in Bethlehem at the barley harvest, a foreshadowing that good is about to come. And so we end Act 1 and begin Act 2. Act 1 ends with the faithfulness and loyalty of Ruth, and then we are introduced to another character of loyalty and kindness. So in the beginning of chapter 2, now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go into the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." And Naomi said, "Go ahead, my daughter." And this next part is just so geniusly crafted that she went out and entered a field and began to glean behind the harvesters. And as it turns out, she was working in the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just that setup is so great that it just so turned out, as it happens, she found her way into the field of this close relative of the family. And then the next verse, in verse 4, says, just then Boaz arrived. So just as she is finding out that this is Boaz's field, he shows up in quite a dramatic fashion. And he greets the harvesters, saying, "The Lord be with you," and they say, "The Lord bless you." And so as the day goes on, Boaz notices Ruth, and he asks his overseers, "Who does this young woman belong to?" And the overseer replies, "She is a Moabite, the one who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest." Now it's interesting to see that Ruth was harvesting behind the harvesters. So she probably wasn't getting that much grain, because the reapers would come, and whatever they dropped, the harvesters would pick up. And if Ruth is behind the harvesters, she's probably not getting that much at all. But Boaz notices her and goes up and says to her in verse 8, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my women and work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and if you are thirsty, go and drink water from my water jars that the men have filled." And so this is exceeding kindness on the part of Boaz, because the law of Moses did allow for widows and foreigners to come into the fields to glean so that they would have something to eat. But he is showing her more kindness than what the law requires. And so at this, in verse 10, she bows her face to the ground and says to him, "Why? Why have I found so much favor in your eyes, that you have noticed me, a foreigner?" And Boaz replies, "I've been told about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you left your father and your mother in your homeland and came to live with a people that you did not know before." So we see that the reason that Boaz is being so kind to her is because he knows her to be a kind woman, that she's self-sacrificing and loyal to her mother-in-law. And so just as Boaz didn't have to give her more than was required, he does it just as Ruth did not have to follow Naomi to Bethlehem. So kindness is being showed with kindness. And he says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done, and may you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you now take refuge." And so I'll paraphrase the next few verses, but as the day goes on, Boaz continues to show her kindness by giving her leftover food and having the reapers drop some food for her. And when the day is over, she beats it out and what's it called? she threshes. Thank you. She threshes her gatherings, and it comes out to about 30 pounds worth of grain. And so she lugs all this home, and Naomi says, "Where did you glean today?" This is in verse 19. "Where did you glean today, and where did you work? And bless the man who has taken notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man that I worked with today was Boaz." And Naomi says, "The Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." And she added, "The man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Now, this tradition of the guardian redeemer was meant for families where no male heir was left alive. So there are stories of a brother marrying his dead brother's wife to provide him with a son, so that their land, so that their property could be inherited and be kept in the family, and to provide a way for the widows to live. And so just as the end of Act 2 of this chapter is closing out, we see that Naomi's hope is beginning to return. That there is hope on the way, that there is a close relative of theirs that can redeem them from their situation, that can provide for them, and that can give them the hope that was lost in the first act. And so chapter 2 ends in this way. Naomi encourages Ruth to continue to stay with Boaz in his field and to work with him until the harvest is over. And the chapter ends in verse 23. "So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvest was finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law." So as we end Act 2, we have to ask ourselves the questions that we did at the beginning and at the end of Act 1. How does this small picture of just a family trying to provide food for themselves, how does this small picture affect God's bigger picture? And does God care, and is God acting in this small picture? Well, let's look at the small picture, at the zoomed in picture for Naomi and Ruth. It starts with them just wanting to find some field to get food so that they can live. But what started with gathering food at the beginning of this act ends with gathering hope that there is someone who can help them and that their situation is about to turn for the better. And so we'll kind of end there at this halfway point where the suspense is built up to a fever pitch, where we kind of know what is happening based on the characters and the situations, and that what started out horribly and what started out with tragedy and bitterness is about to turn for the better. We'll end there, but we have to ask ourselves those same questions that we asked ourselves in the beginning. Does God care about the small picture of our lives? Is God involved in this small picture of ours? We know that He is involved in the big picture, that He has a plan to redeem the world and to save us. But is He involved? And does He care about the small picture? I think based on the story that we read, the answer is yes. God is involved in the small picture. That even though tragedy strikes, that bitterness comes, that pain is overwhelming, God sends us people like Ruth and like Boaz were sent to Ruth, people who exhibit God's character, who exhibit loyalty and kindness in those times when the small picture seems so dark and so bleak. And once we see God acting in the small picture, it gives us context. It gives us the context that God is also working in the big picture. That while, again, suffering and pain and bitterness may abound, God is showing us His character in the small picture so that we can get a little bit of context, even just a little bit, into what God is doing in the big picture. That while we are shown kindness and loyalty by people like Ruth and Boaz, by our friends and family who show God's character in their kindness to us, that God is going to redeem us, and that he will continue to show us loyalty and kindness, not only in our small picture, but in our big picture as well. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you again